What happened later in the 2023 season? Let's talk it out. Welcome into a delayed edition of Fantasy Baseball today on Thursday, January 11th. Everybody is present once again. Frank, Scott, and Chris. Today on the show, Japanese starter Shōta Imanaga has finally signed. Which team? We'll talk about that. And we'll be taking a closer look at everything that happened later in the 2023 season. I know things happened. Football started up. Maybe you were out of your fantasy baseball league at that point. This will act as a bit of a refresher. But first, here we are, one day late, and let me just kind of set everything up and let everyone know what happened. This was about 15 minutes before we were about to go live last night. There was a big storm outside of my building where I live.
I mean, not just outside of your building. It was pretty nuts.
There was a huge storm in New York yesterday, and I heard a huge bang right outside my house, and boom, electricity just shut off, did not turn back on until 2:30 in the morning. And honestly, I'm just happy that it didn't happen while we were recording because that would have made things a lot tougher.
Yeah, I don't know how we got to come up with like a contingency plan because I don't have, neither of us has any control over the podcast right now. So we just have like a stream going indefinitely until you get power back.
Yeah, basically.
Actually, I do want to say I was just walking around and I tripped. I knocked something over. It was my bad. I'm sorry.
That was the loud pop. Was Chris falling?
I knocked something over.
How dare you, Chris? Anywho, let's start with Shōta Imanaga, who has signed a deal with the Chicago Cubs and a pretty interesting contract. 4 years, $53 million. And after the first 2 years of the deal, the Cubs have the option to extend the contract to $80 million over 5 years. So essentially, if they like what they've seen, they can tack on one more year worth $27 million as the fifth year in that deal, which would bring the total to $80 million. Shōta Imanaga is a 30-year-old lefty coming over from Japan, where this past year he had a 2.66 ERA, a 102 whip, 10.6 K per nine, 1.4 walks per nine, 3 straight seasons with a sub-3 ERA. He sits 91 to 93 miles per hour on the fastball. It is a deceptive fastball that comes from a lower release point. We've heard of more pitchers doing this in recent years, that vertical approach angle. Imanaga has a really good one. And as a result, a deceptive fastball. He pairs it with a sweeper and a slider. Might not sound like much, but according to Eno Saris, Imanaga led all pitchers in Stuff Plus in last year's World Baseball Classic. So I put some stock into that. I think it's pretty interesting. The early ADP for Imanaga, 242.7 over at the NFBC. I think there will be a bump now that he signed, obviously. But going right around pitchers like Tristan McKenzie, Nick Lodolo, and Charlie Morton. Scott, your thoughts on Imanaga, maybe where he's going to wind up in your rankings. I'm pretty excited. I'm bullish. He's going to be a top 50 starting pitcher for me.
Well, yeah, I was going to say top 60, but I'm enthusiastic about him. So if you're saying top 50, maybe I need to move him up. I don't know. I feel like there wasn't all the enthusiasm was for Yoshinobu Yamamoto. And so Shōta Imanaga was just kind of the also ran. And I remember in our mock draft about a month ago, I took him, but I took him very late. And I don't know. I gathered from some of the chatter in the chat room that maybe I shouldn't have taken him at all. But it seems like maybe because of Eno Saris and that stat that Imanaga did have the highest Stuff Plus in the World Baseball Classic, better than Yamamoto, better than any major leaguer who was pitching there. Maybe that alone has created this new enthusiasm for him. It's an interesting profile because he is kind of a soft tosser by modern standards. And so by those traditional measures, Yamamoto is amazing by every measure, but Imanaga doesn't really rate. And so I could see why, I could see taking a more pessimistic angle with him because of that. But in addition to having those fastball characteristics that are so valued in the modern game, he also has like incredible control. His 1.4 walks per nine last year in Japan, granted, but it would have ranked 4th among qualifying major league pitchers, walks per nine. His 8-to-1 strikeout to walk ratio would have ranked 2nd, I believe, looking at an article I wrote first, but I think it's actually second. I think he was behind George Kirby for strikeout to walk ratio. Again, in Japan, that doesn't mean that's exactly how it's going to go in the majors. But the point is, for what he lacks in those traditional indicators, Imanaga really stands out in two areas that I think could make him a surprise contributor in fantasy. And so count me among the optimists. And yeah, I would say, I don't know. The fact he's going to the Cubs doesn't really change anything for me. He is a bit fly ball prone, so maybe he could have some bad home run games there. But you know, for where he's going, I'm not inclined to worry about that for Imanaga.
I do think that there is a chance that with Yamamoto coming over in the same offseason, that Imanaga has kind of been overshadowed a little bit by him. And look, Imanaga is not the same level of pitcher as Yamamoto or even Kodai Senga, who came over last year. But just to, again, put some numbers on it, his K per nine and walk per nine were both just better than Yamamoto over in Japan this past year. So again, he's not as good, but like, he has a way of getting strikeouts, and he's a really good control pitcher. So I'm a fan so far, everything that I've read. Chris, what do you think about the fit? So I think the NL Central is a good landing spot just in terms of competition for Imanaga, but heavy fly ball pitcher. We know the ball travels when the wind is blowing out in Wrigley Field. And according to StatCast, Wrigley has the 11th highest home run park factor. So there were some teams that were a little bit scared off by that fly ball tendency, but maybe it'll kind of be a moot point based on like the strikeout to walk ratio that Imanaga poses.
Well, I think it's likely to be an issue. You know, the home runs, you look at, he only gave up 1 home run per 9 last season. You have to take into context that Japan is kind of in like a dead ball era right now. I think the league average ERA over the last 3 seasons was 3.26, which is significantly lower than the majors. So that's something to keep in mind with all pitchers coming over from Japan. And he gave up 1 home run per 9. The league average was 0.8 home runs per 9. In the majors last season, it was 1.2 per 9 for pitchers. So, it's 50% higher. So I do think home runs are likely to be a pretty significant issue for Imanaga. And that's without even accounting for a significantly more difficult quality of competition. Like if he gave up 1.7 home runs per 9, it wouldn't really surprise me. It's not impossible to succeed in that way. It's just you have to be really, really good at limiting base runners. You have to be really, really good at pitching with runners on base, because if your home runs are predominantly more tilted towards when runners on base, then it's going to be an even bigger issue. So, you look at some of the pitchers who succeeded last season with home runs per 9 in like the 1.5, 1.4 range. Like Freddie Peralta gave up 1.41 home runs per 9 last season. He was pretty good. I don't think Imanaga is likely to be an 11.5 K per 9 guy. So, I think it's a somewhat narrow path, but like Logan Gilbert might be a high-end comp. A guy who doesn't get a ton of strikeouts, but isn't necessarily a terrible strikeout pitcher. Doesn't give up any walks. The home runs, sort of make up for that. So I think that's like a ceiling play, maybe a Chris Bassett.
I'm thinking like Bailey Ober. I'm thinking Imanaga could have like a Bailey Ober type outcome, or maybe be kind of Nestor Cortez like. Which sure. I know Nestor Cortez is a difficult profile to pin down because his last 2 years were disparate. How do you pronounce that word? But you could tell I'm a writer first, because then I drop these words I use in writing. And
there's a lot of words like that for me. Yeah.
So anyway,
I think I got called out on Twitter once for saying apropos of nothing. One of my biggest, most shameful moments on this podcast. It's apropos.
Imanaga, I don't think Imanaga is going to be competing for Cy Young awards. I think my expectation of what he's going to cost is a big driver of my enthusiasm for him. And so I think that's important to keep in mind in this discussion.
Yeah. A few other things here for those who care about projections. If you look at Steamer and you run it through an auction calculator, they have Imanaga as the SP29 in projection. So obviously that's very bullish. Maybe they'll kind of change some things based on him landing in Chicago with the Cubs. But as of now, that's where they stand on Imanaga. And it's funny you bring up Nestor Cortez, Scott, just as like a comp, because Lance Brazowski did a great breakdown on Imanaga on his YouTube channel. And he brought up Nestor Cortez's fastball as a comp for Imanaga, as how it's kind of been like a deceptive fastball for Nestor Cortez. And obviously it worked 2 years ago. Last year he was hurt. And we'll see if obviously that can work for Imanaga.
I didn't even read that one. I didn't even read that one. It's disparate. I had it right the first time. You guys probably knew that, but I needed to know.
You know, he's got big vocabulary guy, big knower of all things that are not baseball and like Pokemon. You know, that's me. Chris, any last words before it sounded like you wanted to say something?
Oh, I mean, the sirens were going off. I have two things to say. One, a couple other comps I was thinking was like Eduardo Rodriguez or Braxton Garrett, like getting there a little differently, but like a mid to high 3s ERA, not necessarily a ton of innings. Those are a couple of them. And then, sorry, this is totally unrelated, but Frank, you said something. Have you watched Pokemon Concierge?
No, I have no idea what that is.
It's delightful. Check it out. It's on Netflix. It's like the total turn your brain off. Your brain turns into mush while you're watching it. It's great.
That sounds great. And
a lot of Psyduck.
Yeah, and look, no one probably cares about this. I'm in an early draft over at the NFBC, and just I guess muddy where your mouth is. I drafted Imanaga as my SP5 on this current draft that I'm doing. It's a 15-team league. I think I got him in like the 14th or 15th round. So again, I think the price will go up. I like him. He's going to be a top 50 starting pitcher for me. Shōta Imanaga to the Chicago Cubs. Let's get into what everybody missed down the stretch of the 2023 season. Chris left us in August. Some people fell out of contention in their league. We get it. Football started up. So again, this will be a little bit of a refresher. And you can read Scott's article on the site because he goes way more in depth and talks about way more players. It is a super long, thorough article, and I highly recommend you check it out.
I appreciate that Scott writes it for me every year.
We're going to talk about maybe 50% of what's actually on that article today. And
not much, huh?
Yeah, maybe.
I mean, it's a 25-minute read according to the estimate here at the top of the article. So, I mean, if we just straight up read it, we might run out of time.
Let's start with some of the strong finishes. And there's only one place to start, honestly, and that's with Cole Ragans. In his 11 starts, once he was up for good, Ragans had a 2.70 ERA, a 106 whip, 11.6 K per nine. He throws 5 different pitches between 10% and 40% of the time. His fastball was up almost 5 miles per hour year over year, from 92 miles per hour to 96.5 miles per hour. This is a player you are going to hear us talk about a lot. He is a polarizing player. Scott loves him. And I spoke about some of the reasons, Scott, but I guess if you want to give people another reminder why you love Cole Ragans with what he did down the stretch.
I mean, gosh.
Where do I start?
Where do I start? He looked like God's gift to pitching, honestly. It was the slider that really brought everything together because he wasn't throwing it much during his time with the Rangers, working mostly out of the bullpen, and the numbers were kind of meh. But he did show those huge gains of velocity during his time in the Rangers bullpen, like a 4 mile per hour increase across the board from one year to the next. And I remember taking note of that last spring and thinking, man, maybe Cole Ragans could be this like super deep sleeper if he could ever find his way into the starting rotation. Well, it took him being traded to the Royals, and then him incorporating the slider after joining them that immediately became his best swing and miss pitch. It just seemed to improve the effectiveness of all his pitches, rounded out his arsenal in the perfect way. So now you have a left-hander whose fastball peaks at 99. I think it hit 101 at one point. Yeah. So, I mean, among the hardest throwing left-handers ever is Cole Ragans. And he has this full arsenal of swing and miss pitches, and what it amounted to in his 11 starts once he was up for good, starting for good with the Royals. 11 starts. He had a 2.70 ERA, 106 whip, 11.6 K per nine. And yeah, I mean, if if you kind of tuned out once football got going in August, you missed all of that. And Cole Ragans is still a nobody to you. He is far more than a nobody. There are some risk factors here. Control has been an issue for him throughout his career, and it became more of an issue in September specifically. He's also had two Tommy John surgeries, and if he's throwing at velocities he never used to throw at, you would think that would put more strain on the elbow, and maybe with that health history, that would be a concern for Ragans. But I've told you before, Frank, I was telling everybody listening throughout the offseason, my approach to pitching this year is all in on upside, maximize strikeout contributions, and let the ERA and WHIP fall where they may, because in this environment, I don't think you can count on anybody to have a reliably low ERA and WHIP anyway. And so with that approach, Ragans makes sense for me as a top 12 pitcher.
All right, devil's advocate.
Gosh, I was going to ask Chris, where do you think Scott has Ragans ranked? But Scott,
I was going to guess like 15.
I know, I said too many things.
It's all good.
All right, devil's advocate. You guys remember 2020, right?
Yeah.
Most starting pitchers made around 12 starts, right?
Yes.
That's how many Cole Ragans made.
Mm-hmm.
Here's a random selection of pitchers who were top 20 in wins above replacement in the 2020 season. Dinelson Lamet was 5th, 2.09 ERA, 12.1 K per 9. Herman Marquez was 7th. Dylan Bundy was 9th. Kenta Maeda was 10th. Let's see. Marco Gonzalez was 15th. Hyunjin Ryu, I mean, he was actually good. Dallas Keuchel had a 1.99 ERA for the Chicago White Sox that year. Carlos Carrasco's last good season. Zach Davies had a 2.73 ERA. I think Cole Ragans is probably better than all of that. And the reasons.
So. I mean, it's a good thing my argument wasn't really about the numbers, but
a lot of people, I don't want to say a lot of us, a lot of people thought Zach Plesac was really good because he had 8 great starts in 2020. And now, look, we're going to talk about Tarek Skubal at some point, I assume, right?
That was going to be my devil's advocate to the devil's advocate.
I have Tarek Skubal as a top 12 starting pitcher, and he made 15 starts.
Yeah.
However, Tarek Skubal had also been a top prospect and had a pretty good 2022 season.
True.
Obviously, it was a very, very different type of very, very good season. But I'm mostly with you on Ragans. And the deeper I dive into it, the more I will probably like him. I certainly don't have him as a top 12 starting pitcher, but it's hard to argue against the stuff. There's a lot of fluctuation in monthly pitching splits in general, and especially with Ragans. Like, you look at the swing and miss rates with his cutter were only good in September, and that was when he started throwing it more, so those things might be related. His curveball swing and miss rate before September
5 pitches
was pretty mediocre.
I don't
right now,
care
what I'm saying is before September, it was like the fastball was really good, the changeup and slider were really good, and then after that, it was pretty iffy. And then September, all 5 were really good. And so it's one of those things where I could see, like, does he have too many pitches? Does he we're devil's advocating here. We're trying to make sure he doesn't just walk through beatification.
Yeah,
that's where the devil's advocate comes from.
I get it, but like we could do this with all of my pitching rankings.
If
we
for sure.
Start here because if there was a pitcher who had done over 30 starts, anything close to what Ragans did in those 11, I ranked him ahead of Ragans. It's just that there's not many pitchers like that.
Yeah. Something you will learn, Chris, as I have already this offseason, is that Scott does not care about downside for his starting pitchers at all. It's just, give me the upside, give me the strikeouts, and we see
Scott is finally seeing things my way
with the ranking of Cole Ragans.
We've been working together for 14 years. 13 years, and he's finally seeing it my way on starting pitcher.
Well, maybe. I mean, you could. Yeah.
Chris, have
It's been
a
having
journey.
done this for 16 years. My approach to pitching has had its ups and downs, its ins and outs, and I kind of think this is in a way returning to the roots of pitching evaluation, the sorts of things I was doing before the juice ball era, basically. But I know, yeah, you have made a similar case before that given the inherent risks at starting pitcher, you're mostly going to focus on upside.
Now, I think the question really isn't where do you have Cole Ragans ranked? It's if the number 12 starting pitcher goes off the board 50th or 45th on average, are you taking him 45th or are you taking him 65th overall?
Well, you don't have
or 80th or 90th. What like that? That's the question. Yeah.
Well, yeah. So I get the question, but the thing is, why would you, knowing that I can pull up the ADP here on Ragans. It is 113.
Mhm.
So in every draft that Scott is in, he could just say,
right. That's what I mean, though. Is he jumping 5 rounds or 2 rounds?
Well, I've been drafting him where I rank him so far. I mean, I've only done a couple mock drafts at this point. But what's probably going to end up happening if I remain kind of out on a limb on what's his ADP right now among starting pitchers? Where do you rank according to ADP? ADP?
I think it's between 30 and 35.
Yeah, he's 49th in pitcher overall. And there's probably 10 closers.
I have him at SP 28. So,
oh my gosh,
which is, I think it's a fair range. If you look at years past, like starting pitcher rankings, 20 to 30 is where you typically find a lot of the quote unquote breakout starting pitchers.
Well,
okay.
And that's why I have Grayson Rodriguez.
I can afford to move. I can afford. What I was going to say is if I remain this far out on a limb on Ragans, it's even further out on a limb than I thought. I can afford to move him down quite a bit and still basically always get him. But I think that's from a strategic standpoint. That's what I'm going to have to do, because if I keep Ragans ranked 11th, 12th, wherever I have him, I'm probably never going to be able to draft like a Freddie Peralta or Kodai Senga or a bunch of other guys that I'm higher on than the consensus because of their strikeout upside. And so just to maximize my opportunities at getting those pitchers, I might have to move Ragans down, even though that's not where my heart wants him to be.
All right, we've got to move on. We've talked about 2 players in 20 minutes. A quick note here, FBT is a finalist for the Best Baseball Podcast category in the Sports Podcast Awards. Thanks to all of our listeners. We actually won this award last year, and now we're looking to go back-to-back. So you can help us bring home the hardware by clicking on the link in the podcast and YouTube descriptions, or you can scan the QR code, which is on the top right of your screen on YouTube. The whole process should take you less than a minute, and we really would appreciate it. Thank you for your continued support. And just a quick reminder that you can go back and listen to everything we did earlier in the offseason, because we never stopped podcasting. So we have position recaps. We have Scott's early rankings. We broke down top prospects at each position with the Welsh. I did a podcast last week with Lance Brazdowski where he broke down Shōta Imanaga in depth. So you can go back and listen to all of those podcasts on demand. Let's take our first break. When we return, we'll talk about a few outfielders that finished very strong. We'll do that right after this. Welcome back in. We're doing what you missed later in the 2023 season, and wanted to pick back up with a few outfielders that finished really strong. Nolan Jones, in the month of September, hit .349 with 7 homers and 12 steals. He recorded both his 20th home run and 20th steal of the season on the final day of the season, making him a 2020 player in just 106 games. Scott, I know that you're a big fan of Nolan Jones. I noticed you have him ranked 18th at outfield. His ADP over the last month over at the NFBC, 14th outfielder off the board. So if you want Nolan Jones, once we get drafts up and running, you might have to pull him up a little bit.
I might have to. And looking at some of the players I rank ahead of him, Christian Yelich feels like more of a floor play, which I'm surprised in a 15-team league that they want to lean on the floor play a little more, because obviously, Nolan Jones not exactly proven that may turn out to be a totally wasted pick. I have Kyle Schwarber ahead of him. I could be talked out of that. There's some malleability in my outfield rankings from 15 to 20, and I may end up moving Nolan Jones up a few spots because of that. I'll also point out we have one source of ADP right now, and eventually we'll have more sources, and there's going to be differences among the sources. So I don't want to get so sucked on this one source of AD, so what's the word? Fixated on this one source of ADP that I totally rearrange my rankings around it. But yeah, I mean, the bottom line is what Nolan Jones did with the Rockies once he was in the lineup full time was pretty spectacular, and the data pointed to it being a possibility. Hits the ball very hard, good on base skills, obviously makes the most of his speed, was aggressive on the base paths, strikes out too much, but you don't worry about that as much for a Rockies hitter because of the BABIP boost that comes from playing at Coors Field. So I think there's 5 category potential and a lot of upside here. What did I say?
It was you almost said like Babu. I'm sorry.
I don't even know what Chris said, but I'm just.
I think it was.
Probably should have repeated.
You almost said like Babu Boo or something.
Babu.
It sounded like just baby babble, basically. Sounded like a robot. Yeah.
Sorry, this is why I can't
Beep
be on
boop.
the show.
Yeah, BABIP boost for Nolan Jones, which is what
It's a hard combination of syllables.
That is
now the one thing I would say is like he was actually better on the road last year than at home. That's not going to happen. I don't know. Maybe he's like a 935 OPS true hitter, and what he did away from Coors Field is real. In which case, he might be a first-round pick.
Right.
That's probably not the case, though. And it's probably more that he's like a 928 OPS hitter at Coors Field. Probably more like a high 700s or low 800s guy away from Coors Field. So, like, the overall line, I think, like, we're not going to get a 931 OPS from Nolan Jones again, I think. But he doesn't have to do that to justify this spot. If he's a 931 OPS bat again, we're probably way underdrafting him, even in the 4th round.
Absolutely.
The other outfielder here is Seiya Suzuki, who, look, he was going through it last year, the middle part of the season. I remember at some point, David Ross gave him a couple of days off as like a mental reset. And then Seiya Suzuki just hit the ground running after that. So from August 1st on, he hit 350 with 12 homers, an OPS over 1,000. He lowered the ground ball rate. He was hitting more fly balls, more line drives, and just crushing the ball. 91 average exit velocity, 13.2% barrel rate during that time. Chris, I know that Seiya Suzuki is someone that you and I have been on in the past, and just the way that he finished the season kind of gives me some hope that, all right, maybe he's starting to figure things out. Coming over from Japan, maybe it took a couple of years, but if he has a skill set where if he puts everything together, I think we can get like 25 homers, 10 to 15 steals with a really good batting average.
Yeah, he's a really good athlete, 79th percentile sprint speed. He was one of my favorite breakout picks last season. I guess it kind of ended up being an okay pick in the end.
Once everybody stopped paying attention.
Yeah, once everybody stopped paying attention.
Happens.
Yeah. But like he was a guy who the quality of contact metrics as a rookie were very good in a way that wasn't necessarily reflected in the overall numbers. Like you said, Frank, I think it's reasonable to assume, especially with hitters, this is something that you see when guys change leagues. More so, I think, in the pre-balanced schedule era, when guys just didn't face pitchers from the other league as often. There was often an adjustment period, whether it was a full season or a couple months. Guys who switch leagues tend to do worse. And it's not unreasonable to assume that a guy who's playing against brand new competition for the first time in his life, might need more time to get acclimated. And I think that's a reasonable explanation for what we saw from Seiya Suzuki. And I think, you look at the quality of contact metrics, they're all pretty much backing up what he did overall last season. I don't think you look at what he did in August and September and say, hey, we've got an 1100 OPS bat here. It's probably more like, hey, he can be a mid 800s OPS bat, but like you said, with 25 homer upside and the speed to be a 15 to 20 steal guy. If he, he's been very inefficient so far. That's something that I tend to not care too much about inefficiency unless it leads to the player not running more. So that's the unknowable thing. Stolen base percentage tends to fluctuate quite a bit from one year to the next. So if he goes out and steals 18 out of 23 bases next season, I wouldn't really be surprised, even though he's been much worse than that so far.
I do like the fact that the Cubs brought in Craig Counsell as their manager, and the Brewers have been really aggressive on the base paths under him, the past however long he was there. So I think there's a chance that, some of the Cubs hitters could improve their stolen bases a little bit here in 2024. I want to move on to two Orioles pitchers who both finished really well. I mean, Kyle Bradish, it was really like the final 3 months of the season. But Grayson Rodriguez, after returning from the minors, a 2.58 ERA, a 1.10 WHIP, and specifically his final 6 starts of the season, a 1.80 ERA, 1.11 WHIP, nearly 10 strikeouts per 9. Kyle Bradish, I mentioned it, his final 3 months, 16 starts with a 2.14 ERA, a 0.93 WHIP. If you look at the season-long numbers, Bradish was second in Stuff Plus, Saris' Stuff Plus metric, behind only Corbin Burns. And he made some big pitch mix changes, lowering his four-seam fastball usage. He threw his slider more, his sinker. He has an elite curveball. I think there's so much to like about both of these guys. The ADP over the last month, Grayson Rodriguez, the SP21 off the board at 71.5. Kyle Bradish, SP27 as at pick 95.5, both going inside the top 100. Scott, does that surprise you for both of these Orioles pitchers?
Inside the top 100, you say?
Yeah, for both. For Grayson, it's top 75 too.
Look, I have them both ranked high, but maybe not quite that high. Bradish, I have ranked higher than Grayson Rodriguez. So I guess just comparing those two players against each other, I'm higher on Bradish. I think my concern with Grayson Rodriguez is that while he definitely looked better coming back from the minors, throwing more strikes, having a good swinging strike rate. The strikeout rate itself, the actual number of strikeouts he was getting, was a little underwhelming for a young pitcher of his stature. And it could just be, I mean, look at the high end of the pitching ranks. Guys like Garrett Cole, Corbin Burns, guys we've come to know as 11, 12 K per 9 guys were more like 9.5 K per 9 guys this past year. And it could be that the environment's changing in a way that you don't see as those crazy high strikeout rates from really good pitchers. But I think it's a vulnerability for Grayson Rodriguez until he's really proven himself. And so I wouldn't want to invest in him as more than like ideally like a number 4 pitcher on my roster, but more realistically a number 3 pitcher. And I think I could probably, in that range you're talking about, I think I could find pitchers who still have a lot of upside that I believe in more. Kyle Bradish being one of them, just because I think he's just a little more experienced, and I trust him to take on the workload that would allow him to maximize his win potential for the Orioles a little more than I do Grayson Rodriguez. And I mean, that Stuff Plus indicator that you mentioned, Saris was pointing that out for Kyle Bradish even before the season. It kind of put him on my radar as sort of a fringe sleeper. I didn't end up with him on any rosters, but like it was a seed was planted in my mind when I saw that prior to the season that, hey, maybe there's something I'm missing here with Kyle Bradish, and he could become a worthy fantasy pitcher. And certainly over the final 2/3 of the season, that seemed to happen.
One thing I want to point out on Grayson Rodriguez is he doesn't look great by K per 9. He was just under a strikeout per 9 innings in August and September. 59 strikeouts and 59.2 innings. League average K per 9 last year was 8.74. So he was, in terms of K per 9, really, really close to league average. League average strikeout rate was 22.7%. He was at 24.8%. So he was about 10% or 2 percentage points, however you want to frame it, better than league average by K rate. It's just that when you're dealing with small, this is a good example of why K percentage is better than K per 9 in smaller sample sizes. The larger sample sizes, it tends to come out in the wash, but he had a 1.09-ish whip. I don't know what it was exactly because I just didn't click that part. League average whip was 1.31. So this is one where K per 9 probably underrates him as a strikeout pitcher because he was pitching so well otherwise. He was seeing fewer batters per inning, leading to fewer Ks per 9, if that makes sense. So that's one where, while he was, I think, still a little underwhelming in terms of strikeout rate, he's someone that certainly you would think is in that like 27 to 28% strikeout range more than 25%.
Yeah.
He was above average on a per batter basis. It just, he pitched so well that it didn't show up. And, and I think Grayson Rodriguez is probably someone who needs to, there's probably some tweaking left in the arsenal and how he deploys it, because the slider's a really good swing and miss pitch. He only threw it 14% of the time. The curveball, pretty good swing and miss pitch. He only threw it 8% of the time. That's probably something where, as he gets a little more experience, he'll probably, most pitchers throw their fastball less the more experience they get. So that's something that I do think it's, him and Yuri Perez stand out as guys who I think will take a big step forward in their strikeout rate in 2024.
Yeah. I mean, I don't even know how much I believe the idea that, Grayson Rodriguez, he's not a good strikeout pitcher, because, I mean, you look at what you were talking about, you look at the swinging strike rate, which I pointed out. You look at the arsenal, which is full of swing and miss pitches. But like, until he does it, I've never been a big fan of the unless he's actually done it, we shouldn't pay for him like he's done it, which will make me miss out on Bobby Witt in round 1 sometimes. But it'll prevent a lot of misfortunes as well. And once he came back from the minors, Grayson Rodriguez never had more than 7 strikeouts in a game. And so I have a hard time just presuming that those strikeouts will come when as a top 75 pick would require me to do.
I think I would expect it though, Scott, because you did see it in the swinging strike rate, right? His final 13 starts after returning, 13% swinging strike rate. If you just compare that to, qualified starting pitchers, that would have ranked 9th among all starters. So if he can maintain that level of swinging strikes, I do think you can project, 9, 10,
right.
8 or 9.
Okay, but he's
Grayson Rodriguez.
I think the bigger thing is
he's going ahead of Kodai Senga.
Yeah, he's being drafted in. He's being drafted.
I don't have him ranked ahead of Senga, by the way. Like, I wouldn't do that.
Yeah, well, that's my point. Is I see the upside. I think he's probably going to meet the upside. But what are you giving up in pursuit of that upside? And it's too good for me. If we're just going by ADP, it's too good for me.
Yeah, it's the opportunity cost for Grayson Rodriguez, and when we get down to other ADP. It might turn out to be the same thing for Yuri Perez and Bobby Miller. I mean, these are pitchers that are really talented and we like them, but you do have to pay the price so far in early drafts to get those guys. Let's stick with the pitching. I want to take a look at 5 late round starting pitchers that all ended the season really strong. And just going to rattle off a few stats from each of these guys. Michael King's final 8 appearances were all starts, a 1.88 ERA, a 1.10 whip. That included a 13 strikeout performance against the Toronto Blue Jays. Michael King is now with the San Diego Padres via the Juan Soto trade. Nick Pivetta, from June 28th to the end of the season, 3.35 ERA, a 0.97 whip, 12.9 K per 9. And when I had Lance Brazdowski on, someone who I think we all respect, really smart pitching mind, I asked him for some early sleepers, and Nick Pivetta was the first name that he mentioned. So he is in on Nick Pivetta. Ryan Pepiot, now with the Tampa Bay Rays, severely lowered his walk rate, and we saw just flash with the Dodgers late in the season, and obviously he was enough to be the main key piece coming back in the Tyler Glasnow trade. Emmett Sheehan, also with the Dodgers, finished the season really strong, as well as final 3 appearances, 15.8K per 9, flashing some of those numbers we saw in the minors. And then Christopher Sanchez, who came on strong with the Phillies, really out of nowhere, changed up who he was, increased control, like something we've never seen from him in the minors. Final 17 starts, a 3.32 ERA, a 1.02 WHIP, 58% ground ball rate. Lots to like with all these names. Chris, is there maybe one or two that has stood out to you when just kind of diving in, doing your rankings, just some kind of early standouts, I guess, based on these strong finishes from these 5?
Yeah. So my bold prediction is that in March, Ryan Pepiot's ADP is going to be sub 150. I don't think there's any way a guy who had this kind of run at the end of the season and pitches for the Rays isn't going to get just a crazy amount of helium to the point where his ADP in January is about 200. That's perfectly fine. I love it. I will draft him. I think he's going to get pushed way up draft boards. This seems like a perfect combination of factors that the fantasy baseball community is going to fall in love with. We're going to get some good reports. He's going to look good in spring training, and all of a sudden his ADP is going to skyrocket. So I think it's unlikely I'm going to draft him too much. Michael King, I know he was great. I'm surprised. I guess this is another one where the price isn't so outlandish. He's the 61st pitcher, 150.63. It was a weird way to say ADP. We never say it that way. Michael King has had a lot of trouble staying healthy over the course of his major league career. I guess we haven't noticed it because he's been a relatively low profile middle reliever / setup guy. Even 150, I think is hard to justify, even given the upside that he showed. He's never done this, anything close to this, over anything like 2 months as a starting pitcher. I mean, we're talking about a sample size that like Zach Plesac's 2020 was bigger, right? Like there's no way I can buy into 38 innings.
It's a different situation because we have seen Michael King be a really good reliever for a long time. And so now it's just being tested in a different role. And so far, he's passed the test with flying colors, actually sustaining his velocity, unlike pitchers normally do when they move from the bullpen to the rotation. Now, the durability is a major question mark, but I don't know that the performance is that much. And since I am trying to maximize the upside of my staff, my fantasy staff, not wanting to fill it with a bunch of globby pitchers, wanting to kind of identify the pitchers who could potentially transcend the glob and load up on as many of those as I can. I'm probably going to be more invested in Michael King than you are, and probably Pepiot too. It's unfortunate because I mean the conceit of the article that we're talking about here and this podcast is that these are the things you're probably not aware of from late in the season. But because Michael King and Ryan Pepiot got traded, they were the centerpieces of trades for much higher profile players. It kind of put what they did late in the season under the microscope. So I'm not sure it's going to sneak up on people the way it might have otherwise if they just stayed put, because people had to look into, oh, why was this team so interested in this guy? And oh, look at what he did. That's why. So far, I'm fine with the ADP where it is, but if you're right, Chris, that these players will be elevated from where they are now, then I may not end up with as many shares of them as I presume I will.
I will just say this. If I'm going to make that bet, mid-round starting pitcher with durability questions, but high upside, Carlos Rodon's going two rounds later. And they're not mutually exclusive. You could take both. But Carlos Rodon has done that for more than 38 innings as a starting pitcher. And the injury track record for Carlos Rodon is significant, but it's really significant with Michael King, who has also never done it for 180 innings.
I get what you're saying, but like come week 1, I'm much more likely to start Michael King than Carlos Rodon. And I mean, depending how spring training goes. If Rodon looks like Rodon again, it's a different story. But if that happens, then Rodon's moving way up my rankings too.
Chris, something interesting that you said about Ryan Pepiot and his rise. I'll just quickly mention 2 names in relation to that. Jeffrey Springs, Drew Rasmussen. Remember when
they both shot way up last year in spring?
Crazy because of what they did. They obviously look great in spring. If Ryan Pepiot looks great in spring too, you get that Tampa Bay Rays tax on top of it. Then I agree. I think he's someone that could move up quite a bit. Christopher Sanchez, just wanted to give him another quick shout out. I mean, he's going about the latest of that group, him and Emmett Sheehan right around pick 250 over the past month. If he stays here, I am all about it. I just love what Christopher Sanchez did. Wipeout changeup, great ground balls, nearly a 12% swinging strike rate, 10 strikeouts in 2 of his last 3 starts as well. Once against the Atlanta Braves too.
He was awesome because like I was on the show until like mid-August, and every single Friday it was like, hey, sleeper pitchers, Christopher Sanchez. Or like every time he was up, his roster rate would still be like 52%. And so it'd be like streaming Christopher Sanchez. And it worked out great for like a month and a half in a row.
Yeah. Oh, and like it just kept getting better. And
yeah,
like it's one of those, okay, Christopher Sanchez, 26-year-old nobody who's suddenly striking out 10 Braves. My gut tells me this is probably a Zach Plesac situation. And so, you know, I'm not inclined to rank him that high, but just like intellectually looking at what he did, my brain likes him more than my gut, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And so what does that amount to on draft day? It probably amounts to me investing no more than a late round pick in Christopher Sanchez. But luckily for me, he doesn't require more of an investment.
Well, yeah, the difference is Zach Plesac's ADP was 80.8 in 2021. And Christopher Sanchez is not.
I wonder what the over-under on Zach Plesac mentions was for today's podcast, because I feel like we mentioned
crushing the over
5 times already. I was not expecting that. Let's take
Angels just signed him.
Let's take our final break. When we return, we'll talk about a few flops towards the end of the season. Players who did not finish so well. We'll do that right after this.
There's no Belichickery here.
When Sunday football isn't enough.
Dislike that take.
Great take.
That other pregame show will put you over the tops.
I'm all in. Let's go viral here.
Every Sunday, all the insight you need on CBS Sports Network.
Welcome back in. Let's take a look at some of the players who kind of stumbled to the finish line. And we will start off with one, Elly De La Cruz, who again, we've already talked about him a good amount this offseason. We will continue to talk about him a lot. He'll be a very polarizing player because over the past month, he has an ADP of 23. So if you're playing in a 12-team league, still a second-round pick, despite what happened in the second half, batting 191 with a 36% strikeout rate. Big struggles against left-handed pitching. Now, I understand the enthusiasm, the hype. He's a very fun player to watch. He had 35 steals in just 98 games. But Scott, obviously, we can't look the other way when it comes to how Elly De La Cruz finished the season and big struggles against left-handed pitching.
No, we can't. But he's so prolific at a base deal. I mean, did you see the last note in me talking about his struggles there? Even during that time in the second half where over the final 2 months, I should say, where Elly De La Cruz was batting 200 and striking out 35% of the time, he was still the 13th best shortstop in the in categories leagues and the 17th best in points leagues as a 200 hitter, striking out 35% of the time because he was such a prolific base stealer. And that makes up for a lot of warts. And it's kind of new, or at least unfamiliar to us, because it's been so long since we've seen players steal bases in these quantities that we're not familiar with how much it can make up for flaws like that. And I think in Elly De La Cruz's case, as long as he doesn't slump his way out of a job completely, I'm just not that stressed about the downside. The ADP is more than I want to invest in him. So like if we're just doing it purely on are you drafting Elly De La Cruz at cost or not? I'm not going to, because I think there are better players to draft in that 3rd round range. But if he slid to round 5, I'd be happy to draft him, because I think his fantasy output is going to be good.
Yeah, the only way
batting average isn't.
The only way I could see him sliding to round 5 is,
it's never going to happen.
It'll happen in a points league, but
Yeah.
I think any kind of categories league,
He'd have to get hurt.
the latest he'll go is like maybe he could slip to the 4th round in some drafts. But even that, like maybe you can kind of buy him in the 4th round. Chris, coming back after
a lot of weird things happen in drafts. You guys are so colored by the numbers. Weird things happen all the time.
Yeah, I mean it's weird. We're doing a podcast about baseball, Scott. Obviously, we're going to be all in on the numbers. Chris, coming back from football, what was your initial reaction? Just seeing, okay, like Elly De La Cruz, ADP, still kind of like borderline 2nd, 3rd round pick. What was your reaction on that?
I'm surprised it's not higher, especially when you're talking about high stakes leagues where people tend to chase outliers and tend to chase breakouts and tend to chase really, really talented young players, because, there were, those, I don't know what they call them, but NFC does like restart drafts at the All-Star break, and they'll have these competitions where you, maybe not the NFC, maybe one of the other providers, I don't know, but he was going 1st overall in some of them, not all of them, certainly, but he was a consensus 1st rounder at the midway point in the season when he had played like a month. And so I think that's why I don't think I think it's much more likely he goes in the 1st round than the 5th round of any given draft. And so do I want to draft him there? Like Scott said, no, I don't want to draft him 24th overall, and I was thinking like, well, O'Neal Cruz is 50 spots later than him, or 60 spots later than in drafts. But like Scott said, Elly De La Cruz, even when things are going poorly, and as a hitter, he was worse last year than O'Neal Cruz was 2 years ago. But that's stolen base.
I can't even get Jose Ramirez in my 1st round. I don't know how Elly De La Cruz is getting in there.
Someone's going to get 30 homers and 60 stolen bases in their heads and talk themselves into it.
Things happen in drafts.
Yeah, I think that's more likely, but it's not particularly likely. He's likely to be a 2nd or 3rd rounder, and because of the prolific stolen bases, because he's the fastest man in baseball. Probably not the fastest man in the world, like he likes to say, but still plenty fast. And because he hits the ball so hard, I think there are people who are going to talk themselves into him in the 2nd round every single draft by the time we get to where it counts. And it probably won't be me, but I put together a content plan for the next month and a half or so. And one of the things I'm going to do is a YOLO players, or a FOMO players, excuse me. He's definitely going to be on there. I got my acronyms wrong. Like Elly De La Cruz, I'll probably play 11 or 12 leagues, whatever it is this year. I'm going to have Elly De La Cruz on at least one of them. Just it's not going to be fun to have 11 teams with no Elly De La Cruz.
Yeah, I was just thinking about it in my head. I'm like, if this ADP stays there, I will not have a single share of Elly De La Cruz, which sucks, but
now you got to. Come on. You can't do every draft with optimal efficiency. Sometimes you got to say YOLO.
All right. We'll see which draft Chris actually winds up with Elly De La Cruz in. Wanted to mention Randy Arozarena, who kind of scuffled in the 2nd half. I guess didn't kind of. He did scuffle. He hit 220 with a 700 OPS, but maybe it was just kind of regression from, him getting off to a hot start, because at the end of the day, it's 3 straight years of Randy Arozarena going 2020 with an OPS between 773 and 815. He's finished as a top 50 player in Roto each of those years. It's kind of annoying the way that he gets to that finish line, but at the end of the day, he just kind of does what he does. Scott, is there anything that you actually saw that legitimately worried you about Randy Arozarena's second half?
Well, I think I've been worried about Randy Arozarena for a long time because he is far outperformed his expected stats basically from the start of his time with the Rays. And in a year where stolen base totals were going up across the league, they were becoming more common. Randy Arozarena became less prolific on the bases. He went from stealing 32 bases in 2022 to stealing 22 bases in 2023. And that drop is even more than it seems because, again, there are more stolen bases available throughout the league. So if Randy Arozarena is just a kind of good base stealer instead of a very good base stealer, then there's a lot of pressure on his bat to deliver optimally. And I think there's a wider range of outcomes. I mean, look, he ended up with a 254 batting average. He hit 23 home runs. Like, is that good enough in this environment to justify the cost? Just straight up, what are Randy Arozarena's final numbers were based on that, with that very poor finish dragging them down. I'm not so sure about that.
His ADP over the past month is 46.8. So, I mean, I guess technically, again, he's finished as a top 50 player 3 years in a row. Maybe, he doesn't give you as much room for profit. So if that's something you're worried about, maybe Randy Arozarena is not for you, but I think he's pretty safe in what he's going to provide. Again, I think it's a 2020 profile, but given his swing decisions, it wouldn't surprise me if he kind of goes on this Javier Baez path. One of these years, it could just completely fall apart for him.
He's 29 on opening day, which is surprising because he hasn't been around that long, but that's not, oh no, range. He's not a running back, but it is.
It's not.
If he fell off.
Oh no, it's like
yeah. It's a little surprising, and so if he fell off entering, his late or his potential. God, what am I trying to say? A year away from turning 30, that wouldn't be surprising.
No, not terribly.
I think there's more room for downside than upside with the Arozarena at this price.
Want to quickly talk about two other outfielders here who scuffled towards the end of the season. Christian Yelich, from August 1st on, hit 248, 3 homers, 6 steals. The power and speed, I guess, was still okay. A 723 OPS. Quality of contact came way down. The ground ball rate went way up. And it sounds like the back was acting up and causing him issues once again. The other name is Lane Thomas, who in the second half hit 223 with a 705 OPS. And he's someone that just has huge splits. He crushes lefties. He was awesome at home. Obviously, the opposite against righties and on the road. And then we have, these second half numbers. Chris, are you concerned about either in the way that they finished? Christian Yelich, Lane Thomas?
I am not concerned about Lane Thomas and how he finished because Lane Thomas will be on exactly 0 of my teams this year. I want nothing to do with him. I'm making an assumption that this was Lane Thomas turning back into who Lane Thomas has always been. And that is just not a player that I'm particularly interested in. Christian Yelich, I don't know. We've been through this a lot. And he was still on a 119 run pace and a 24 stolen base pace. And so that's from August 1st on. So it's like, I think even if he struggles, Christian Yelich is likely to still be a very good player, or at least a useful player. I just don't really want anything to do with Lane Thomas. I didn't buy what he was doing last season. I thought the Nationals absolutely should have traded him at the deadline. And I think it's more likely you're dropping Lane Thomas than that you're starting him by August.
All right, let's wrap up with 4 pitchers who finished the season, on a downswing here. And we mentioned one already, Carlos Rodon. Overall, he had a 6.85 ERA and a 1.45 WHIP in his debut season with the Yankees. I'm not sure that he was ever healthy. Maybe I'm just making excuses. That was kind of capped off with his final start against the Royals of all teams, where he allowed 8 earned runs and did not record a single out. It was just Yikes. Big yikes on Carlos Rodon. Hunter Brown, got off to a good start, but over the final 3 months had a 6.95 ERA, which brought his overall ERA up to 5.09 by season's end. Lucas Giolito made 12 starts with the Angels and Guardians combined, 6.96 ERA, 1.48 WHIP, and now he's pitching in Fenway Park in Boston in the AL East. Don't love that. Andrew Abbott also got off to a great start. His first 10 starts, 1.90 ERA, 0.96 WHIP. Final 11 starts, 6.42 ERA, 1.78 WHIP. Scott, is there a name here of these four that you're looking to maybe capitalize on them having a rough finish to the season?
I think so. Wait, let's go through the names. It was Carlos Rodon. Okay, I got him right here. Carlos Rodon, Hunter Brown, Lucas Giolito, Andrew Abbott, right?
Yep.
I mean, Rodon would be the one who I'm most hopeful for, just because we've seen him be a legit fantasy ace multiple times in the years leading up to this very disastrous and injury-plagued 2023. I have no idea what to expect from him, and I wouldn't want to make a sizable investment in him. But fortunately, I don't have to. I mean, where I have him ranked is actually a little bit higher than his ADP right now. And so I think it's not entirely no risk. I mean, we're talking about a top 175 pick, but it's late enough that, particularly if you've really already formed the foundation of your pitching staff, you can afford to luxuriate on the upside of Carlos Rodon and just the hope that it was a total lost year where he wasn't right and he bounces back completely, and that would be amazing. It might win you your league.
Chris, of those four names, I think the only other one I might be willing to invest in just to capitalize on this is Hunter Brown, just because some of the underlying numbers were still really good. 352 xFIP, 374 Sierra, over 10K per nine, lots of ground balls, 53%. The one thing I don't love about Brown, the ADP over the past month, it's still relatively high. It's 190 inside the top 200. And we've mentioned other names already that are also going in that range. So you got to pick and choose. I don't know that you can wind up with all these pitchers that you like, from, let's say, 175 to 250. But Hunter Brown does live in that range. What are your thoughts?
I think the thing you have to keep in mind with Hunter Brown, I believe his career high in innings was like 131 in 2022. And obviously a lot of his struggles last year came after he had already reached that point. So I do think that doesn't necessarily excuse or explain his second half struggles, but it's a possible explanation for why he was so bad. And yeah, I think Hunter Brown is someone in the 190 range of starting pitcher. If I think reasonably you could take like 2 starting pitchers in your first 100 and then load up on a lot of these upside guys. Cause I really like Rodon's price. I really like Hunter Brown's price. I love Andrew Abbott at 267 like that. It looked for a while like he was going to be a top 150 pick. It looked like he was going to be a top 30 starting pitcher in ADP with the way he started off. And then obviously a lot of the things that we were warning about at the time came to pass. He was a fly ball pitcher pitching in arguably the worst park to be a fly ball pitcher in, who wasn't missing enough bats. The thing is, he had an 800 OPS against righties last season. That's really, really bad. And that's part of the problem when you rely on a sweeper for your swings and misses is sweepers are just death against opposite-handed batters. His changeup was actually really good last season. 39.4% whiff rate. It was his best pitch. I think he needs to throw that pitch more, especially against righties, to try to neutralize that. But if he can do a little better with that platoon split, all of a sudden, I think there's a path for Andrew Abbott to be a top 30 starting pitcher. I'm certainly not ranking him that way, but he's a very talented young pitcher who threw 162 and a third innings last season. So I have no concerns about the workload. I do think Andrew Abbott, look, there's a chance that he just wrecks your ratios and it's not worth the price, even at 276. It's not worth having on your team, but the upside is absolutely worth chasing with one of your final round picks in a standard 12-team league. I think for sure with Andrew Abbott.
Yeah, looking a little bit at the pitch mix here, Andrew Abbott against righties last year, he used his changeup 19% of the time, 197 batting average against, 268 slug. and a 39% whiff rate. It's really good. His curveball, which he also used 19% of the time, got crushed against righties, which makes sense, right? It probably just like falls right into that kind of happy fun zone for right-handed pitchers. So I think maybe tweaking the pitch mix a little bit. I also think the Reds kind of overworked him. If you remember when he first got called up, he was going 6+ every time out, 100+ pitches. And I'm like, dude, this guy's a prospect. Like, don't run him into the ground. And ultimately, it seems like that's what the Reds did with Andrew Abbott. So I mentioned we were going to get to like half of Scott's article. No way. We got to about a quarter. So if you want to read the rest of what happened down the stretch, again, go to cbssports.com/fantasy/baseball and make sure to read Scott's article. We're going to wrap there. For Scott and Chris, I am Frank. Thanks as always for tuning in to Fantasy Baseball today. Please make sure to follow and leave a 5-star rating on Apple or Spotify. And we'll be back again tomorrow. Bye-bye.